Have you ever known someone who insisted they weren't like that, only to watch them become exactly what they claim not to be? It's a peculiar experience, one that leaves you questioning not just their self-awareness, but your own judgment as well. Today, I want to share a story about perception versus reality, about the gap between who we say we are and who we reveal ourselves to be through our actions. This isn't just about pointing fingers or telling tales. It's about understanding a fundamental aspect of human nature that affects all of us in our relationships, whether romantic partnerships, friendships, or even professional connections. The phrase, "I'm not like that," carries a certain weight. It's a declaration of character, a boundary drawn in the sand, a promise made not just to others, but often to ourselves. When someone tells you they're not the kind of person who gets jealous, or who lies, or who breaks trust, you want to believe them. We all prefer to take people at their word rather than assume the worst. And that's exactly where our story begins. Before I dive into the details, let me clarify that this narrative weaves together experiences from several real relationships to protect identities while preserving the essential truth of what happened. The lessons, however, remain authentic and universal. Alex was charming from the beginning, thoughtful, attentive, and refreshingly self-aware. During those early conversations that form the foundation of any relationship, he made it clear who he was, or rather, who he wasn't. "I'm not the jealous type," he'd say with casual confidence. "I've never understood people who need to control their partners." He spoke about his previous relationships with remarkable maturity, explaining how communication and trust were non-negotiable values for him. "I've seen how jealousy destroys relationships," he explained during one of our late-night conversations. "My dad was like that with my mom, always checking her phone, questioning where she'd been. I promised myself I'd never be that person." These weren't just throwaway comments. They were deliberate statements about his character, his values, his very identity. And they weren't limited to jealousy. Alex positioned himself as someone who valued honesty above all else. "I'm not someone who plays games," he'd say. "If something's wrong, I'll tell you directly. I can't stand people who give the silent treatment or manipulate situations." He described himself as an open book, someone who had learned from past mistakes and grown into a person who approached relationships with transparency and emotional intelligence. In those early days, there was no reason to doubt him. His actions aligned with his words. He was supportive when I spent time with friends, never questioned my loyalty, and approached disagreements with remarkable calm and clarity. When I shared stories about controlling exes or manipulative friends, he would shake his head in disbelief, genuinely perplexed by such behavior. "I just don't get why people act like that," he'd say. "Life's too short for those kinds of games." Friends who met him were equally impressed. "He seems really grounded," my best friend commented after meeting him for the first time. "You can tell he's done the work on himself." Even my brother, who typically approached my partners with skepticism, gave his nod of approval. "He looks you in the eye when he talks," he observed. "That says something about a person." Looking back, I realize now that we were all responding not just to who Alex was, but to who he said he was. There's something powerfully persuasive about someone who can articulate their values and principles with conviction. It creates a framework through which we interpret all their subsequent actions. When someone declares, "I'm not like that," they're not just describing themselves, they're shaping how you see them. The first hairline cracks in this carefully constructed image appeared so subtly that they were easy to dismiss. There was the time he checked my phone while I was in the shower. I noticed the apps had been rearranged slightly. When I mentioned it casually, he admitted to just seeing who had texted because the notification sound had made him curious. He seemed embarrassed, apologized immediately, and promised it wouldn't happen again. It was easy to write off as a momentary lapse rather than a contradiction of his stated character. Then came the questions, innocent at first, but gradually more probing, about my male friends. "So how do you know Mark again?" he'd ask, his tone casual, but his eyes watchful. "And you two were never anything more than friends?" These questions often came after I'd mentioned plans to meet these friends, delivered with such apparent casualness that it took me time to recognize the pattern forming. Let me explain why these seemingly minor incidents matter. They represent the beginning of cognitive dissonance in a relationship. When someone's actions start to contradict their self-proclaimed identity, it creates a psychological tension. As the recipient of these mixed messages, you face a choice. Do you believe the words, or the actions? Most of us, especially when emotionally invested, choose to believe the words. We become co-creators in maintaining someone else's self-image, even as evidence mounts against it. A mutual friend noticed before I did. Has Alex always been this possessive? She asked after witnessing him call 3 times during a 2-hour lunch we were having. Each call had a plausible reason. He needed to know what time I'd be home. He wanted to check if I could pick something up on my way back. He just wanted to say he missed me. But strung together, they formed a pattern of monitoring that was becoming harder to ignore. He's not possessive, I found myself insisting. He's just a planner. He likes knowing what's happening. Even as I defended him, I felt a flicker of doubt. Was I describing Alex, or was I describing the Alex he had told me he was? The turning point wasn't dramatic, no explosive fight or shocking revelation. Instead, it was a moment of clarity during what should have been a minor disagreement. I had made plans to attend a college friend's weekend birthday celebration in another city. When I told Alex, his response seemed supportive on the surface. "That sounds fun," he said. "You should definitely go." But what followed was a week of subtle undermining. Comments about how the timing wasn't great, questions about who else would be there, reminders of other commitments I had that somehow wouldn't actually conflict with the trip. 2 days before I was set to leave, he suggested that maybe I should just go for 1 day instead of the plan 2. "I'm just thinking about you," he said. "You've been so tired lately. A shorter trip might be better for you." His concerns sounded genuine, and for a moment, I considered changing my plans. But something stopped me, a realization that this pattern had played out before with other events, other friends. When I gently pointed this out, that his behavior seemed at odds with his claim of not being the jealous or controlling type, his reaction was illuminating. "I'm not like that at all," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I'm nothing like those controlling guys you've dated before. I'm just looking out for you. The fact that you'd even compare me to them shows how little you understand me." It was the defensiveness, the immediate deflection, and the subtle blame shifting that finally brought everything into focus. This wasn't just about this particular weekend or this particular disagreement. It was about the fundamental disconnect between who Alex claimed to be and who he actually was, not just with me, but perhaps even in his own mind. The confrontation that followed wasn't planned, but it was necessary. "I need to talk to you about something important," I began once we were both calm. "I've noticed a pattern where your actions don't always match what you say about yourself." I gave specific examples: the phone checking, the frequent calls, the subtle sabotage of plans with friends. "These aren't the actions of someone who isn't the jealous type," I explained. "And when I try to talk about it, you shut down the conversation by insisting that you're not like that." His initial response was predictable: denial, followed by attempts to justify each individual incident. "That's not fair," he said. "You're taking things out of context." But as I held firm to the pattern I'd observed rather than debating each example, something shifted in his demeanor. The defensiveness gave way to a quieter, more reflective mood. "I really don't think of myself as jealous," he said finally, his voice softer. "My dad was the jealous one. He was controlling. I've always promised myself I wouldn't be like him." There was genuine confusion in his eyes, as if he was encountering a version of himself he didn't recognize, or perhaps had never allowed himself to see. This moment revealed something crucial about the "I'm not like that" declaration. Sometimes it's less about deceiving others and more about protecting ourselves from uncomfortable truths about who we are. Alex had defined himself in opposition to his father's behavior, but had never developed a positive identity of his own when it came to handling insecurity and trust. His self-image was built on what he wasn't, rather than what he was. The weeks that followed were challenging. Once the contradiction between Alex's words and actions had been brought to light, it couldn't be unseen by either of us. He alternated between defensiveness and genuine attempts at self-reflection. "Maybe I do get more anxious than I realized," he admitted during one conversation. "But that doesn't mean I'm controlling. It just means I care." This partial awareness was both a step forward and a new form of self-deception. It acknowledged the behavior while still preserving the essential "I'm not like that" narrative. It's a common stage in the journey toward authentic self-awareness, admitting to the actions while still distancing from the implications about character. For me, the revelation created a different kind of challenge. If Alex wasn't who he claimed to be in this regard, what other self-descriptions might prove false over time? The foundation of trust wasn't completely broken, but it was certainly cracked. Every future declaration of, "I'm not the kind of person who," now carried an asterisk, a mental note to watch for the evidence rather than accept the claim. Friends and family had varied reactions when I shared what was happening. Some urged immediate separation, classic manipulator behavior. One friend insisted, "It'll only get worse." Others counseled patience. Everyone has blind spots about themselves. At least he's trying to see it now. Their different perspectives highlighted an important truth. There's no simple answer to how we should respond when someone proves to be different from who they claim to be. The question becomes, is this a person who cannot see themselves clearly but might learn to with time and feedback? Or is this someone who deliberately presents a false self to others? And perhaps most importantly, are they willing to face the contradiction when it's pointed out? Or do they double down on the illusion? For Alex and me, the journey toward resolution took unexpected turns. After initially trying to work through these issues together, including a few sessions with a couples therapist, we ultimately decided to end the relationship. The breaking point wasn't the jealousy itself, but rather his continued inability to fully acknowledge it without qualification or deflection. "I might have some insecurities," he would concede, "but I'm still not controlling like your ex was." The comparison, the ranking of degrees of jealousy, revealed that he was still more committed to the narrative about himself than to addressing the actual behavior. Our final conversation was surprisingly peaceful. "I think part of me has always known," he admitted. "There were times I'd catch myself checking your location or feeling annoyed when you made plans without me, and I'd think this isn't me. But instead of really facing that, I'd just remind myself that I wasn't like my dad, so whatever I was doing must be normal." This insight, though it came too late for our relationship, suggested the possibility of growth. Perhaps the end of our story was the beginning of his journey toward greater self-awareness. At least, that's what I choose to believe. The lessons I've carried forward from this experience extend beyond romantic relationships. I've become more attentive to the gap between declared identity and demonstrated behavior in all areas of life. With friends who insist they're always there for you, but disappear during difficult times, with colleagues who claim to value honesty above all, but engage in office politics, and even with my own declarations about who I am and what I stand for. I've learned that when someone emphatically tells you they're not like that, it's worth paying special attention to precisely that aspect of their behavior. Not because they're necessarily being deliberately deceptive, but because these pronounced declarations often point to areas of insecurity or unresolved conflict within themselves. The things we most vehemently deny in ourselves are frequently the very things we haven't fully confronted or integrated. This doesn't mean we should approach relationships with suspicion or cynicism. Rather, it suggests we might all benefit from a more nuanced understanding of human nature. People are complex, contradictory beings. Most of us genuinely want to be the best version of ourselves that we describe to others, even when we fall short of that ideal. Perhaps the healthiest approach isn't to take either words or actions as the definitive truth about a person, but to recognize that the relationship between the two reveals something important. When someone's actions consistently contradict their self-description, it's not necessarily evidence of deliberate deception. It might instead reveal a person who hasn't yet reconciled who they aspire to be with who they currently are. As for my own growth from this experience, I've become more thoughtful about how I describe myself to others. I try to speak less in absolutes, "I never," or "I always," and more in terms of aspirations and ongoing work. "I'm trying to be more patient" feels more honest than "I'm a patient person." This shift acknowledges the gap that often exists between our ideal self and our actual behavior, without surrendering the commitment to growth. I've also developed a more compassionate view of the contradictions I observe in others. When someone proves to be different from who they claim to be, it doesn't necessarily mean they were lying, to me or even to themselves. It might simply mean they're human, with all the complexity and contradiction that entails. The story of someone who says, "I'm not like that," and then proves otherwise isn't ultimately about deception or hypocrisy. It's about the challenging journey toward genuine self-knowledge, a journey we're all on in different ways. It's about the stories we tell ourselves about who we are, and how those stories sometimes protect us from uncomfortable truths. If there's one thing I hope you'll take from this reflection, it's a gentle invitation to examine your own "I'm not like that" declarations. Are there areas where your actions might tell a different story than your words? This isn't about self-judgment, but about the kind of honest self-reflection that makes authentic connection with ourselves and with others possible. Because in the end, the most meaningful relationships aren't built on perfect consistency between words and actions. They're built on the willingness to acknowledge the gaps when they appear, to own our contradictions with honesty and humility, and to grow together through that truth-telling. That's the kind of authenticity that no amount of "I'm not like that" declarations can replace. Total _char_count, 13,425.